Hi, and welcome to Dipping in and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate on this Friday morning to be sitting down with Charlotte, Michelle, and Sarah. I would introduce them all and what they do, but I think it's better for each individual to do that. And it's the first time we've ever had three people, so I'm rather excited and about the topic. So, good morning, all of you.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
So, should we start with Sarah?
Yeah, I'm Sarah Taylor. I'm the founder and director of PEEPSA, which stands for Prevent, Educate, Eradicate Post-Separation Abuse. I set that up as I'm actually a survivor of domestic abuse and the family court.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Shall we, Charlotte?
Yes, I'm Charlotte Budd. I'm a survivor of domestic abuse, and I've dedicated the last 5-6 years to campaigning and raising awareness. I'm also an ambassador for IDA, which is Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, where we help educate in the workplace. I'm also a holistic therapist, and the goal is to help people through their traumas. Obviously, I was inspired by my own journey, helping people to find safety and to heal in a somatic way.
Amazing, brilliant, thank you. And Michelle.
So I'm Michelle Eldin. Like the two other ladies here, I'm a survivor of domestic abuse and just really passionate about the reform of the family court system and supporting victims of abuse as much as possible. I'm an international best-selling author around domestic abuse, and like Charlotte, quite similar. I'm also a trauma therapist and help support children and women through their personal journeys.
Amazing. I'm feeling slightly inadequate now in this conversation. What an abundance of knowledge we have this morning. It's incredible. And I think we were going to, obviously, in terms of what we discuss, and I think many people know when I'm talking about domestic abuse, a massive factor for me is around post-separation abuse. It's something that isn't particularly understood. Certainly not by society as a whole. It's very much the attitude of, well, you've left now, therefore, everything should be okay. Whereas I think we all know that isn't the case. And one of the things we were going to discuss was this Pathfinder. So I'm going to hand over to all of you because I'm sure lots of people won't know what that is, or maybe their experience. It's better for, I think, you all to explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think perhaps if we start with a bit of a definition or what does post-separation look like? And as you said there, Lucy, you tend to think, I think societal perception is when you end a relationship of domestic abuse, that the abuse finishes there and it stops there with the relationship. Actually, it doesn't. And, we see this happening all the time. There's an escalation of abuse. So it doesn't just continue. There's often an escalation of abuse, but where that perpetrator loses control. And that could take many forms. That could be stalking, harassment, using children, the family court, finances. There's so many ways in which they can do that.
Yeah, 100%.
Michelle, we were talking earlier as well, weren't we, about the way that the system is used by the perpetrator to facilitate this continuation of coercive controlling behaviour.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think for me, it's about obviously that abuse moves from kind of behind closed doors, i.e. in the home, to actually more public, using institutions, as Sarah said, like the family courts, even children's schools, victims' employers, the benefit system, CMS, child maintenance. It's sadly not just then limited to that. And I think the whole kind of reason for that is the perpetrator will then try and kind of tarnish the victim's kind of, image within that moving forward, again, to retain power, to retain control of that victim, or to almost punish them for leaving the relationship and trying to move on, which I think is where this conversation is so important, because that education, not only for the victims, but then for those organisations, institutions that the perpetrator then will kind of move their narrative towards, they need to understand kind of the patterns of behaviour to look out for.
Yeah, definitely. And I think along with that, I'm sure you'll all know this yourselves anyway, but for anybody who doesn't, who's listening, is, unfortunately, society thinks, well, these institutions are there to protect the children, are there to protect, the victim, survivor. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more and more now that that isn't the case. And I think, you all have your own experiences of that. And I often say to people when they have asked me in the past, I would say the truth is stranger than fiction. So if somebody comes to me and says, look, you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you, I will always say, I 100% believe you, because the things that I have witnessed myself, the things I've heard, I think that's why society struggles, because I don't think they can believe that this will be allowed to happen. And it's happening every day. It's happening right now while we're recording this. It is unfortunately an epidemic that is worldwide. I do episodes with people from across the globe, and it's the same the world over. And that's the thing I think that frightens me the most.
Yeah, I think for me, from a personal point of view, post-separation really shocked me, because I thought that I'd done the right thing by leaving, and I thought I was really determined to be strong and independent, and it really shocked me and it really wore me down, that post-separation that went on for many, many years. And obviously the family courts became a part of that in my own journey. And when we look about victims leaving and then them finding safety, which is absolutely imperative for their own healing, and in the end of the day, everybody deserves to be safe. That's a basic human right. We need to look at the systems surrounding that then entrap victims in that post-separation abuse. And obviously there are many institutions that do that, from the police to the CPS to child maintenance to, and of course what we're discussing today is the family courts, which is why we decided to campaign for better rights for victims and their children in the family courts.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. And I also think as well, like with the this, oh sorry, I forgot where I was. I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, with the pressure on the victims to leave. So when they're in these domestic abusive relationships, there's a lot of pressure by social workers, for these relationships to end, and, to get the victim to flee that domestic abuse and take their children out of that situation. And as Charlotte said, the system is then not working, because what's actually happening then is, they end up in family court, and then the family court basically put the children back with that perpetrator who they were pressured to leave in the first place. So the system in that respect is simply not working. I mean, the victim, how is the victim supposed to navigate that? On the one hand, they've got to safeguard their children. And on the other hand, they've got to promote this relationship with somebody that they disclose as a domestic abuser, their abuser,
100%. And something that just came to my mind when you were saying it, two things. One was when Charlotte mentioned about the exhaustion. I don't think, unless you've been through it, I don't think anyone can understand truly how exhausting the family court is, mentally, physically, emotionally. And just because a hearing has ended, or maybe that particular final hearing, that isn't the end. And the victim survivor knows it's not the end. They know it's just a pause until the next time. And like you just said then, Sarah, about it's that catch-22 as well. So if a child says, I don't want to go to X, Y, and Z this weekend, this holiday, whatever, and the parent, the protective parent says, okay, then they're in breach of the order. But then when they send that child, well, why did you send that child? So if CAFCAS are involved. So it's this constant cycle of psychological abuse that the victim survivor is being put through by the systems that are there to protect them. And I think that's what is the most frightening thing to me, is you're there to, many victims and survivors have lived in a world where they believe authority is true, is the answer, because they've lived with that authority from the perpetrator. And to find out that those systems are actually not protecting them is just devastating.
No, absolutely. And I think, from personal experience myself and just speaking to other ladies, that's probably the worst thing, actually, Lucy, is just you think there's, lots of organisations out there who are going to look at the evidence and go, oh, crikey, there's domestic abuse here. Can understand why you feel like that, understand why your child feels like that, and then put those pieces of the puzzle together. But actually, from the family court's perspective, and again, my own experiences, all the professionals did was side with the abuser, write, fictitious reports, biased reports that sided with the abuser, and then used my child and I, almost like scapegoated us as if we were the problem. And, from a child's perspective, especially, but obviously as the kind of, survivor of abuse as well, it's the worst thing ever, because like you said, you go into those proceedings, with full faith, thinking, you're going to be protected, the courts primarily narrative is to act in the best interest of the child. But from many experiences I've personally had, but again, speaking to others, it's far from that. You know, it's just, there's no best interest of the child. It's just almost contact at all costs. And the laws that are in place now aren't utilised to actually protect the survivors or the children either.
No,
I think
absolutely.
the biggest issue that we've always discussed and that we campaign for is the transparency and lack of accountability for judges, because the laws are there. And in 2020, we had the domestic abuse bill, which was recognised that there are issues in the family court system, really severe issues. And obviously, there was the report from the Ministry of Justice. So we are aware that there's an issue. The government are aware that there's an issue, and those judges in those family courtrooms are aware of those issues. So they actively choose to ignore the laws and the legislations that have been changed. So what does anybody do from there? There is no way really of holding them accountable. There is no way. I remember when I went through the first bout of family court, I was a litigant in person, and I tried to complain about the judges and appeal. And what I discovered is that they put a reserve on my case. So it meant that every email, every appeal, every time that I emailed in to make a complaint was going to those judges, and for 15 months it was just ignored. And mine isn't an isolated case, as Sarah would tell you from many cases that she's come across. This is what is happening on a regular basis all the time. And the fact that we cannot hold those judges or magistrates and the family courts accountable is absolutely letting victims down and their children, and it's not safeguarding them.
No, it's not. It's not. And it's such an adversarial process as well. And I think what they are failing to understand as a system is, you know, these are victims of domestic abuse. They have been through such trauma, such sustained chronic trauma for a long, long time, built that bravery up and that courage to get a plan into place, a safety plan, reach out for help. They were taken out of that situation. Then, well, they took themselves out of that situation bravely, and their children, and then to think that they are treated like that in family court. The treatment, as far as I'm concerned, and what I see with victims all the time, is the inhumane treatment that they deal with and endure every time they walk into a family court, or every encounter that they have, with the social worker. And I found that, if they try to, advocate for themselves in any way, you're not following the Human Rights Act. You're not following Practice Directive 12J, which is what the court has a duty to follow when there are disclosures of domestic abuse. You're not following the Domestic Abuse Act. You're not looking that, children are victims now in their own right, etc., etc. They are then shouted at, told off with a judge, threatened that they are going to be punished by having their children removed. And if they continue to do it, they're going to be viewed as in an entrenched position. Mother is in an entrenched position because she's disclosing domestic abuse and safeguarding concerns. So mother must be an alienator, and we must take the children from the mother because she's an alienator. And that is what's happening, and it's systemic every single day with no accountability whatsoever. And I'm seeing the consequences and the repercussions of this in the women who've had their children ripped from them unfairly with no good reason at all every day, And it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating because this is the system. This is a very systemic problem. And it needs a whole culture shift. It needs an entirely, a huge change in the system, because at the moment it's stuck. It's stuck. Yeah. They are entrenched. The system is entrenched, not the victims.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And again, when you talk to a lot of victims and survivors, and it's such a good point you're making there. For many, they don't know that what they've been experiencing is abuse. And so when they come to that process of the family court and start to realise, hang on a minute, this person is now trying to continue that power and control, as I think it was Dr. Jessica Taylor said, stalking by proxy, using the family court as a weapon. So that individual is then trying to process what they're experiencing on top of dealing with a very scary scenario. Not just dealing with the family court, the horrific potential of losing your children for speaking out. And so now you're being abused again, like you say, by judges, by magistrates, by people who say, no, 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 because they don't want to open Pandora's box. That's the way I like to view it is. And it's the only way I can make any sense of it is they don't want to touch this. They don't, because if they do, there's going to be a lot of people who historically are going to say, well, that happened to me. Well, that happened to me. And they've got a real crisis on their hands. And that's why they want to bury it. And it's unfortunately now, in some ways, thank God for social media. In some ways, obviously, social media has its constraints, but at the same time, thank God for social media, because people are speaking out now. We wouldn't be able to do this and have this conversation. And I can't imagine the number of people that are going to go, yep, that was me, 100%. And even if you never get the justice that you deserve, in some ways, I think at least you'll have the validation of listening to something like this, knowing that you're not on your own, knowing that you're not mad, you're not crazy, which is always what the perpetrator likes to go to. That's their first demo. Oh, they're bonkers. Oh, they're insane. They need locking up, and yeah. Definitely.
It's not pathologizing. They pathologize victims, don't they? That's what they do to silence us. They'll say, and this happens in family court. We want mother's medical records. Has mother got any mental health problems? There's psychologists that they use who are aligned with the court and who are supposed to be independent, but they tend to find findings of coaching and alienation against the mother and ignore domestic abuse. And they always will say, well, mother's got personality disorder, mother's bipolar, they will pathologize them. When actually what's happened to mother is that she has post-traumatic stress symptoms from being under chronic stress from the system, sometimes for like 18 years, the whole duration of their child's life, It is the ultimate institutional betrayal, I think. You look to them to protect you and they let you down. And they don't just let you down and don't protect you, they actually blame you as well. And I just find that really hard to swallow. I really do.
I think without that, professional training as well, often in the court scenario, you've got the survivor who's obviously, as Sarah rightly said, had years of abuse behind closed doors, perhaps overwhelmed, confused, or literally traumatized. And the perpetrator, who more than often than not is, friendly, charismatic, charming, calm. And then from an outsider, even sadly sometimes from the professional's perspective, that perpetrator will look like the one who's, kind of normal, the good parent, whereas often the survivor looks like the one who can't cope, overwhelmed, whatever that looks like, and sort of the bad parent. Whereas actually it's a lack of understanding and training from the professional side. They just don't get the dynamics of abuse. They don't understand the patterns of behavior, coercive control. And I think the lack of training, from my understanding, on domestic abuse overall, given that pretty much 90%, I think, of family court cases involve domestic abuse, is really, really poor. I think we definitely need more training from the professionals like CAFCAS, social workers, but also, like Charlotte said, we need accountability, because you can have all the training in the world, all the laws in the world, but unless people are adhering to it, and it's people are held accountable, and the family courts are transparent, i.e., we don't have to be quiet about everything, they're open for the public to see what goes on, then I don't believe personally anything will change until those changes take place.
Thank you.
And also, I think where the presumption of contact lies is a really important thing to address. Where there's any type of abuse, the presumption of contact needs to end, because again, you're just entrapping victims and their children into a cycle of abuse that could go on for 18 years. And we recognise in the law that children are victims in their own right, but yet there is still that presumption of contact. So you're saying, yes, there's domestic abuse. Yes, there are issues. Yes, this child is a victim in their own right, but we're going to hand them over to the abuser anyway, and contact goes ahead. And there is no other institution that would do that. It's crazy that that's allowed to happen. And then the cycle never ends for that individual, but also generationally, it just continues, because then that behavior is learned, continued and continued. And when we look at the statistics through society, 1 in 3 women suffer domestic abuse, 2 to 3 women are killed. What are we doing? The impact of these decisions in those family courts are having a much wider effect on society, and the statistics around domestic abuse, that continuation and that entrapping victims and continuating that cycle of abuse for many years and generations.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I do think what ends up happening for children as well, in particular, like you say, is if they do speak out, regardless of whether they're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, whatever age they are, the first thing the perpetrator will do is flip it straight back on to the victim survivor and say they're weaponizing the children. How many times have I heard that word weaponized? They're weaponizing the children against me. And like you say, and having that presumption of contact, that child is then saying, but hang on, this is my safe space and you're making me go to this place where I know I'm traumatized by the sights, the smells, the sounds, the tone that I'm spoken to in, if it's grabbing them by whatever it is, how that parent chooses to behave as an abuser, that child then, it's that relationship between them and their safe person. And that, as you say, it can go on for many, many, many years. But the first thing a perpetrator will do is say, well, they've weaponized them against me. It never happened. And how many times have I heard that? It never happened. The children are making it up. They're imagining it.
Yeah, it's Darvo, isn't it? It's classic Darvo.
Yeah.
They're denying, they're attacking, they're reversing victim offender. It's classic abusive techniques. We know that that's what they do, and they do it in family court. They do it, and sadly, a lot of the professionals and the system does it as well. And they always flip it back. And the other thing is, parental alienation. When somebody is accused, usually a mother is accused of parental alienation, alienating behaviours, coaching, etc. Even though the children are meant to have, their wishes and feelings heard, etc., they're not listened to then, because they're saying, well, actually, if mum's coaching them, mum's told them to say that. So the children could be telling them about disclosures of child sexual abuse. They could be telling them about the most serious of harm that may have happened to them. And their voice, again, is completely silenced. Darvo, mum gets the blame for it, silenced, and very often I think in nearly every case, I was speaking to a family law solicitor the other day, in nearly every case where child sexual abuse is raised, whether it be by the child or by anybody else, it doesn't even have to be the mother, but when that happens, the chances are there's going to be a reversal or a change in residency, and that child will be forced to live with the very person who these claims about child sexual abuse, they committed it potentially in the first place. And they're putting them to live with these people. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Listen to the children, I understand there's got to be a balance. Of course, there's got to be a balance, because sometimes the child will align with a perpetrator to protect themselves. I understand that as well. But if you understand coercive control and domestic behaviour and the dynamics around that, then you'll have a better understanding of whether the child is aligning with a perpetrator, or if the child, is speaking the truth, And I think, again, it comes down to that education, doesn't it, on coercive control and what that looks like as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think, we said that understanding is key, because then you can see repeated patterns. Often with domestic abuse, coercive control, it's not just one instance that means, oh, there's abuse. There's actually a pattern over time, and it can be in that relationship, it can be in court proceedings. I'm sure many of us can say, there was a clear pattern of perhaps reversal of fictitious allegations. They did something, but actually it turns around to us doing something. Or as Sarah said, the child says something, but actually apparently it's not their voice, it's not their narrative, it's actually the mum's narrative. And there's so many patterns that are so clear. And as a professional, they should be able to recognise that. They should be able to say, well, it's not the first time we've heard this. There must be something that needs investigation. Yes, rightly, there should be thorough investigation, which where, practice direction 12J with the fact-finding hearing, again, is key, because you can see those patterns, those behaviours, and actually kind of get a clear understanding of what you need to do to keep that child safe. And at the moment, very often, more so than not, there isn't an understanding. It's just a tick box exercise of, right, we've tried that hasn't worked, now we're going to try that, but with no concern for the long-term or short-term damage done to the children or the parent victim themselves. It's just, let's keep on moving along the line of tick boxes, and if that doesn't work, we'll change residence. And
Yeah.
there's no concern for the child. It's appalling.
It is.
Yeah.
And if we looked at it as all those cases, if you had that before several judges, all those cases unsolicited, these people, these cases don't know each other. You didn't know each other when you were all going through the family court, and yet there are those underlying links between all your cases. Times that by hundreds of thousands, millions
Yeah.
probably across the world.
Yeah.
How can that be that we haven't all gone like the perpetrator does to a handbook, it seems, and do all these things? These are things that are done to the individual. You haven't you haven't chosen to put yourself in the situation where you're in the middle of a family court proceeding. And I think anybody, unfortunately, at the moment would say, I wouldn't want to touch it with a barge pole. I wouldn't want to go near it, and sadly that is the case. It's all these cases have all these links, and yet it's still being ignored.
It is, absolutely. And they're in all these cases, these themes keep coming up again and again, with all the women that I support, it's exactly the same. They're identical themes coming up again and again. They're the same themes that we saw in the harm panel report back in 2020. I know that the Ministry of Justice has yet to produce a review on the repeal of the presumption of contact. Apparently that was finished in October 2023. Why hasn't that been released? That was supposed to be released, consequently from the harm panel report, and it does make you wonder, why hasn't it been released? How damning is it? We know 56,000 private law cases go through the courts in England and Wales every single year, another 50,000 or so public law. And let's remember, a lot of the private law cases that start out just between the parents often become PLOs, they become public law, and often children are put into care. And what I find as well strange about that scenario is, where are the fathers then? If the perpetrators, they're usually the fathers in these cases. They will take the victim to court. They will say all sorts of things about the victim. They'll say they were actually the abusers, or they are alienating, etc., etc. The child should live with me, but then the child won't live with in this case the father, because they're frightened of them. They're saying he's abused them. So then I've seen cases where father says, well, the mother's abusing him or her emotionally, so this child needs to go into care. And I've seen that happen.
Rather than the child being a state, they would actually,
they cause distress onto a mother, the primary carer, knowing that they can't do anything about that. Their child is now not being protected and it's been taken into care. But how can't they see through that, the transparency of that? If they cared that much, they would never allow their child to go into care just because they've so-called been alienated against them. They'd say, look, we can get over that. Come and live with me at least, because I'm the other parent. But they're quite happy for them to sit in care for years on end.
And I think that comes back
to get them back.
Yeah. And again, how many times have I heard, it's never about the children. Never. No. Not in any case ever where a perpetrator has been involved in a family court case has it ever been about what's best for that child. And it becomes it's so transparent on so many levels. Like you say, they would rather see the child in care than be with the mother in that instance, as you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's what's frightening. How can they not see that that's what it's all about? It's constantly get at you, because you've got away. You're starting to slip away from my power and control. So the only way I know to hurt you is through the children. And I will keep doing it. And unfortunately, because of the family court process, like you say, I don't think, again, society realises this is something that goes on for decades. And even when the court order falls away, as they say, at 16, and, realistically, the child by 16, you're not going to be able to force them to go regardless. But actually, the law still says 18. So you've got a child there who may be a very obedient child that says, well, I'm going to have to do it because I don't want you getting in trouble. So I will go for those really formative years of their life where they're shaping their opinions and their thoughts on life. And so it's so unbelievably frightening to see that this is something. And then once the court process is all finished and the children no longer involved, it doesn't stop. And I think that's something else people don't realise is, when the courts are out of it, you'll be okay. That perpetrator, and that's why I think it's so important for people to really be aware, especially if you're listening to this and you are in a situation where you think you're experiencing this. seek support, seek help, because the individual is not going to stop just because the process has stopped. And it's so important to make sure that they realize that, because I think for many, they think, oh, well, it'll all, like when you leave, oh, it'll all be done and dusted, you're fine. That perpetrator isn't going to let go that easily. If they haven't let go for 18 years, they're not all of a sudden going to stop.
No.
I think
It's
that's where
about
it's important.
control.
Yes.
Yeah, it is, Charlotte. No, sorry, I was just going to say, and I think just again, it's important. I know it's hard for victims to document everything, gather evidence, but I think sadly, on an ongoing basis, even after proceedings is finished, it's so important just to keep all documentation, whether it's via a court order app or, just text messages, emails, whatever that looks like, just to document things and just keep a note of, again, those patterns of control or kind of control of arrangements, control of the child. And as kind of physically and mentally draining it is, I just really believe it's something that we all sadly have to do just for our own sake, really. Should the perpetrator either take us back to court or, just kind of do something else that we need to say, look, actually, here's the truth, which is often obviously the opposite of what the perpetrator says. And, we need that evidence trail to support our case.
Yeah, absolutely, because it is about control, and like you said, Lucy, it can go on for so many years, and the damage that is caused to both the victim and the child is awful. And because safe parents are literally expected to pick their children up screaming at times and physically put them in a car, and and this is court ordered, this is state sanctioned abuse, and it goes on from both the institutions and the perpetrator. And like you said, it can go on and on and on. And like Michelle said, keeping records is really vital. And I always advise people to journal as well for their own mental health, to kind of try and get some of it out. But also to keep a record of everything that's going on all the time. And taking care of yourself during that process is vital, because it has such a drain on yourself and your life, and it becomes the focus in your whole life, for which nobody should have to live like that, and no child should have to live like that. But it is vital that you take care of yourself. If you are going through that system, that process, always take care of yourself.
Yeah,
definitely. And the thing is, you're always in that state of fight or flight kind of thing, aren't you? You're at this high state of vigilance all the time, because you're constantly looking over your back. What's going to happen next? What are they going to accuse me of next? What are they going to fire at me next? And all this, it's not even just a question of, well, something bad might happen if they do. It's they could take my children, they could take my child. And for any mother, who's carried a child for 9 months, who's brought this child up, has a close bond with them, has brought them up for years, how must they feel living with that threat constantly of having their child given to that very same person? You're going to be living in a trauma response, I guess, aren't you? Constant trauma response.
It's destroying childhoods, and it's also destroying your motherhood, your parenthood. It destroys what it should be. And it should be a time where you're safe and protected, and it should be a time that you have to enjoy. And instead, it's destroyed because of domestic abuse and the family courts for many.
Yeah, and I think, like you said at the start, Charlotte, I think everyone, literally every single person on this planet, deserves to live a safe and peaceful life, no matter what that looks like. And that is a basic human right. So why are institutions, organisations that are there supposedly to protect us, making sure, pretty much state sanctioned abuse, like we've said, making sure we don't have that peaceful and safe life, for us as parents, but also for our children as well. And, as much as we can try and kind of, learn ways to kind of support our children best we can, which many of us have sadly had to do because of their mental and physical kind of detrimental impacts from the family court as well. Why should we have to kind of lead our life like that constantly, as Sarah said, in fight or flight, trying to get through the next day to make, is our child going to be okay? What are they going to come back to us like if they've had contact with the abuser? And it's just constant fight, quite literally trying to survive. We're literally, it's survival.
It's like you said, it's the most precious time, isn't it? For a mother and child's relationship, it's that precious time. And I don't know about you, but I personally feel like a lot of their childhood has been robbed, and I feel like my motherhood has been robbed because of the effect that it had on my mental health. Having post-traumatic stress symptoms, trying to live my whole life sort of, how can I help myself? How can I feel better? How can I be okay for my children while this process is going on? And once it's finished, what can I do then in case it comes back again, which it did many times, and it does. That is a time where you're supposed to be living your best life with your children, making wonderful memories, and all this kind of thing, not fighting court battles and being drained of every bit of energy that you have. It's purely exhaustive, isn't it? It's just so exhaustive.
I think, and listening to you all is obviously inspirational. I know that, and I know many will feel the same. And I think what's so important as well in all this is what people don't understand. It's important, I think, at this point to mention about the language that family and friends use around somebody who has experienced abuse. So instead of, and I do a lot of this when I'm talking to organisations, and again, for organisations to understand when they're talking to their staff, if it's somebody who's experienced abuse, to say, I know, I understand, you don't know, you don't understand. No one can understand somebody's situation, but to say, I'm here, I'm listening. And for many victims and survivors, they've been desensitized. When you're just talking then about, if anyone who's listening is thinking, I can't imagine my child's childhood being robbed from them, or as a mother or a father, this is my parenting life, is to not have Christmases, not have birthdays, all those things that are so precious. And we all know it. They're only little for a very short period of time. In some way, it seems like an eternity when you're going through the courts. But when you look back and see how your children's lives have evolved, and I do often say to people, if you can, try and look at, say, if you're not seeing them on Christmas Day, it's a date in a diary. Make it Christmas Eve and make it the most spectacular. Children aren't going to remember whether it was on the 25th or the 24th. There are ways of giving back to that perpetrator. You're not going to ruin this for me. And it's so hard and it's so unfair. And there's so many people say, but I shouldn't have to do that. No, you shouldn't. You should not have to do that. But you're not letting them win by saying, actually, I'm going to do this and we're going to have a great time, and it's not going to be something that's destroyed because you've tried to destroy it. But I think it's important that people understand that language we use, how we approach the conversation, how we treat people who have experienced the family court in particular, experienced post-separation abuse, is tread very carefully, because for those people, like you say, that trauma that people have experienced and will continue to, it doesn't stop. I always say that there's no expiration date. It goes on and on and on, and it can impact somebody many years. I've had messages from people saying, I was in the family court 15, 20 years ago, and I'm now actually processing it. That's a huge chunk of your life to lose to it. And I do think it's important as a society, we listen more than we judge.
I think I always say to lead with validation and compassion, and then you can't go wrong. Nobody can not everybody is a domestic abuse expert. Not everyone is going to understand the complexities, but if you lead with compassion and validation, they're some of the most important things that you can give to any victim, survivor, anyone who's going through the family court process. Like you said, it's very difficult for people to really understand the impact of that. And like you said, it's not going away. It's not something that you can just switch off. And like Sarah said, you're robbed of so much. But for those around you, it is important for them to think about their language, think about the environment that they're creating, and to lead with validation and compassion. I think they're really important things.
Absolutely. And again, it's life changing, isn't it? It's completely life changing. In my case, and I know this happens with other women I support, I hear it all the time, they lose their homes. They end up having to lose their careers, because they either lose their careers because they've been found to be emotionally harming their children from parental alienation, so they lose their careers. Some women are so stressed from this chronic stress and trauma that they no longer can go to their jobs. I was one of those women. I had to leave my career and walk away from it, and also it can have a massively damaging effect on your relationship with your child. In many cases, you see this sort of maternal sabotage, I think Emma Katz calls it, where, their relationship has been severely damaged. And she talks about ways of trying to kind of limit that. And she was speaking about, really try to, I think I'm paraphrasing here, but spend as much quality time with them when you can, as much as you can, and don't sort of, I suppose this would be my advice, is don't give them any reason to think you are that person that the other parent is saying you are. Just be you when you're with that child, naturally how you are with that child as best you can, to try. It's damage limitation, because they're still going to hear all this, derogatory talk about you when they go for contact visits with the other parent. But I wish that I had read that at the time when I was going through it, because there have been times with my children that we've really struggled. We really have struggled in terms of our relationship, and also the ACEs. People think once they're out of the abusive relationship, they're safe from adverse childhood experiences. Well, they're not. They're not, because the family court will invade your time and your family life's time so much that it becomes unnatural and not normal. You'll have perhaps social workers coming out to visit you, or you'll have CAFCAS workers coming out to visit you, or you'll be court ordered to do parenting type courses. You'll be court ordered for different organizations to come in and work with your children. And before you know it, you've got so many people involved in your home, in your life, and you've got to accommodate that, because if you don't, they're making reports against you to the court. So that's affecting my children. The school refusal, trauma effects. It's a massive impact on my children as well, and I see it all around me with the women that I support. Huge detrimental effect on them.
I do think as well, schools are another, you just touched on it there in terms of with the children and school refusal. I think it should be mandatory for schools, head teachers, staff to all have training. I found out when I was working for my local domestic abuse charity, and then when I had one of the C.I.P, which for anyone, you all know, but children and young persons, intervention worker, and she's one of the managers. She came onto the podcast and was talking about how it isn't compulsory. She approaches the schools, the primary schools, the colleges, and they don't always want the support, which is quite frightening, because it makes me think it doesn't mean that a headmaster or a headmistress or anybody can't be a perpetrator. And very often those in positions of authority are. And I think to me, it should be compulsory. Teachers they spend so much time with those children, or they're just being a bit quiet. Maybe actually they're processing the fact that they've got to go this weekend to that perpetrator parent. And it doesn't just happen on that Friday evening, it can start on the Monday. And then you have that escalation of going, then you have them come back and you have that de-escalation of trying to bring that child back to the safe space and know that they're in that safe space. And for children, and I truly believe this, I think if you're in year 6 and you're learning about sex education, why can't you be learning about domestic abuse, but in a way that's child appropriate? Because if you have abusive friendships in the playground, who's to say that statistically, if we talk about statistics of how many perpetrators, how many victim survivors, in that classroom of 33 children, somebody eventually is going to be a victim and somebody eventually is going to be a perpetrator. And so why are we not talking about this more with children to an extent that they can think, actually, I do experience at home because I am spoken to like that, I am treated like that, or treated differently from my sibling, etc., etc. And I do think that the whole school process, again, like the family court, needs a massive wake-up call.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, they try to kind of, send fines home to parents as if that's going to magically sort everything out. These parents, which takes me on to another point, actually, is some of these parents are paying huge legal fees just to keep their children safe. Like I said, they've lost their home, they're ending up using food banks, they've lost their career. They could be paying, north of £1,000 a month. They may be getting, paying more legal fees than the money they're getting in to live. So to say, oh, well, if you pay a fine, then perhaps that will sort everything out. You'll make your child go to school, but that doesn't solve the problem.
No.
That doesn't solve the problem. It just makes things worse.
Mhm.
It's all about conversation, about healthy relationships in school, having, age appropriate, having the right interventions, a holistic approach to each child. Yes, I know they're a school, but if they want to clamp down on school attendance and behaviour in school, then they'd be better off to invest some time and effort into this, because in the long run, that will be helpful to them as a school and the children, and that maintaining a relationship between the parents and the school, and the staff.
It's
Yeah, the
interesting.
fact that they don't have domestic abuse training for teachers is shocking, because it's 1 in 5 children that experience domestic abuse, and they are at school 5 days a week for however many hours a day. So that's a huge chunk of their life. And I think the problem is that most teachers or safeguarding teachers in the school are looking for children who are sort of sitting there rocking in the corner and showing real obvious signs, where we know that children that are, say, for instance, experiencing coercive controlling behaviour or emotional abuse, or they're anxious about having to go to contact with a perpetrator, they're going to show very different signs. It might be separation anxiety, other types of anxiety, but there will be signs, and being able to spot those is absolutely crucial for schools, and the impact that they would then have also through proceedings, because they then have a knock-on effect on those proceedings as well. And it's about early prevention, how we educate young people around domestic abuse and healthy relationships. And I do a lot of talks in local colleges in my area, and we always get really good feedback from the students there, but we also get a lot of disclosures, which shows that from a really young age, they're experiencing sexual abuse, domestic abuse, coercive controlling behaviour, and some of them have more understanding than others. Some don't understand it. So it's really important to have that early prevention. Schools are a really key component in that shift culturally and how we approach domestic abuse.
Definitely. And this is where we need that joined up approach, don't we? We need it all linking together. And again, something that's just popped into my head is, how many times does a victim survivor have to repeat themselves to different organisations, to different systems, to whether it's school, CAFCAS, family court, police, child maintenance? These are things. And then somebody within that organisation moves position. So then you have to start all over again. I mean, that within itself is exhausting. And I'm not saying that in life people don't move jobs or things don't happen and we have to repeat ourselves. It's true. But if we know that a child or a parent, if something is going on and domestic abuse has been disclosed, why are we not taking this more seriously? It's treated as if it's just we know it's he said, she said scenario. We hear that time and time and time again. And that's the get out clause, isn't it? Oh, well, it's just it's conflict. It's a toxic relationship. It's a this, it's a that. It's always the easy get out clauses.
Yeah, and they're working in silo, aren't they? That's the problem. They're all working in silo. The judiciary's working in silo, the solicitors are working in silo, the social workers are working in silo, and I think sometimes the victims are the last people to find out what's going on as well. They're not being kept in the loop. And it's easier then for people to kind of twist things and use Darvo, because they're not kept in the loop a lot of the time about what's actually going on with them and their child,
Definitely not.
I think those just joined up working would just, again, in terms of family court proceedings, just become like better outcomes, safer outcomes, risk assessments are clearer, people are kind of working not as Sarah said, in silo, actually as a joined up approach, so everyone knows kind of what the risks are, they can keep the child safe. It's that kind of working collaboratively rather than kind of, as I mentioned before, what appears to me to be like, well, we've done that, now let's do that. And it's not, for some children, obviously, they may want some level of contact, but they don't want to go from 0 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour. They might just want, let's go to 5 miles an hour to start. If that doesn't work, then let's take a step back. Not if 5 miles an hour doesn't work, we're going to shift it to 100 and because then you'll have no choice but to make it work. And it's it's just, again, that I think there is an understanding. I genuinely do think professionals do understand, but I think sadly a lot of it is down to profits. So the family courts are, multi-billion pound industry. They waste billions of pounds of taxpayers' money every single year, unbeknown to many general members of the public. And I think without that profiting from that, without the power and control and misogyny within the system, nothing's going to change until people start to actually put what they should do, the children, at the heart of this, which is what the laws say. But again, going back to that accountability, transparency, until held to account, nothing will change.
No, definitely not. And I was going to say, so in terms of anything we haven't covered, can you think of anything else that, I mean, and to be fair, I think if I was sitting here listening to this and I didn't understand, I'd be going, wow, I need to pause a lot. And one thing that cropped up in my head before was I think unfortunately, because we all understand the terminology, so if people want to go and look at things like what a litigant in person is, that means that it's somebody who doesn't have representation, legal representation. They can have what's called a Mackenzie friend, etc. But you can find all this information out online, but that adds a lot of pressure as well when in some ways I think it's quite freeing for the litigant in person because they can just say what they like. And I think sometimes when you do have a legal representative, you're very much tied to what they are going to say. You can say what you like to them and they're just going to come out potentially with the same thing that they do every time. So that's where it gets difficult as well. But is there anything else that you can think of? And I'm sure we could talk for weeks. We could do an entire series just on this. I could just do a whole season, in all honesty. But is there anything that you three feel that we haven't kind of covered or that we need to make sure we highlight?
Can I just ask, can I just mention the Pathfinder quickly as well? Yes. Only because the Ministry of Justice have rolled out the Pathfinder in response to the harm panel report, as if it's a magic bullet. They know it's not a magic bullet, but apparently it's supposed to kind of, fix the family court in some way. But my experience of that, or the people that I support, the women I support, their experience of that is actually very different. And what you find is that if they've been in proceedings before, very often, even if they're going back to proceedings, with fresh eyes, starting a new case, they're then not allowed to go onto the Pathfinder. So they will just be in the same process that they were in before, usually with the same judge reserved to the case. And I've experienced women, CAFCAS officers saying to these mothers, you can't go on the Pathfinder because I don't believe that you've been abused, even though I'm not willing to look at the evidence. And, all the differences they say of the Pathfinder is me literally having a phone call with an IDVA and me deciding whether I believe them or not, basically, or I accept this domestic abuse or not. So if that's the case, a lot of people aren't even in the Pathfinder in the first place. In Wales, it's been rolled out nationally, and they're supposed to look at the domestic abuse first. So any evidence of domestic abuse is looked at. The experts in domestic abuse and coercive control will pick that up. They'll make a report and they'll give that to the social workers or the CAFCAS officer in the case to help them make their informed decision. But it's still being ignored. It's just literally being stapled to a document in a massive court bundle. And the CAFCAS officers and the social workers who are not trained in domestic abuse are completely undermining the domestic abuse services and undermining the Pathfinder. So, I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's important that the government understand that there are big problems with the Pathfinder. And unless they're addressed, we're going to see much of the same, albeit the cases may be going through quicker, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be resolved, and it doesn't mean they're going to be safe and fit for purpose, So I thought it was worth highlighting the Pathfinder.
Absolutely. And I only discovered recently that CAFCAS released their own policy on domestic abuse and their approach to it. And I'd be very interested to know how often that gets brought into the equation when looking at it. I haven't actually read it myself, but at some point I'll sit down and read it. But somebody informed me about this a few weeks ago saying, well, they've got a policy now around, but is that being used in conjunction with the Pathfinder? Is it being used separately or at all?
from what I've seen, because Wales, Capcas Cymru have just released new guidance as well as Capcas England, and from what I'm seeing, it's been completely ignored in nearly every case, being completely ignored. And it's another situation where the victim will say, "But what about the policy?" And they'll get told off, silence, stop going on about that. In the same way as they do human rights law, Practice Directive 12J, the Domestic Abuse Act, children are rights in their own, in their own right, victims in their own rights. It's exactly the same. They're doing exactly the same with that from what I've seen. So it needs a big culture shift. It really, really does.
Yeah. And I think it's important then for people to know that if you are on the process of looking at this Pathfinder, maybe, do a bit more homework and read up on it and get help and advice, because there are quite a few law firms out there that are, you do the 30-minute free kind of consultation talk. There's also solicitors out there now doing a lot of pro bono work, doing a lot of work where they are willing to, because they understand how serious this is as an issue. And also, if you can utilize, if you do have a local domestic abuse charity, support service, whether it's whoever it is, if you're in the workplace and you're concerned, you can, I do have a lot on my website around a resources page with lots and lots of different resources on there for people, but there is support out there. And I do think if you are on your own and you're trying to navigate this, it's a very scary road, and all the support you can get, the better, definitely. And I'm just going to ask you all, I never do this, but I feel like it today. I don't know, maybe because it's Friday. But if you could all give one piece of advice to anybody that's listening now, and I always have this idea in my head, it's probably middle of the night, someone's listening, can't sleep, worried sick, what would that piece of advice be?
I just would say, surround yourself with good people, like genuine people who care about you, and look after yourself more than you've ever looked after anyone in your life going through this process. That's what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
For me, I guess it would be about maintaining hope. So for some reason, I've always had hope that things will be okay. And there's been what I call like small miracles throughout my case, like thinking literally losing my child completely to our abuser, thinking, life was over, that was that, to actually moving forward positively, or as positively as we can given the situation. So I think never lose that hope that it can take one flicker, one moment for things to change. So yeah, maintain as much hope as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I would say be gentle with yourself, take care of yourself, get support. But also know, and it's really difficult when you're in this because it's so consuming, but this isn't the whole book. It can just be one chapter, and you can build a life around this. I have done that. I've built, I've studied and built, work. I've worked and I've met somebody new. I've gone on to have another baby. I have built a life that I'm really, really proud of, despite of all of the trauma and everything that I went through. And I think if you can do that, try and have a life outside of it, because it's really important to do that, to keep some of yourself safe in some way.
I love that. I love all of those. They need to go on t-shirts. It is that never give up, and none of you have given up, and you are a testament, each and every one of you, to the fact that there is hope. It is, isn't it? It is that hope factor, and as much as it can all seem lost from time to time, when we all have each other, it does definitely lift each other up and go, you know what, I'm not on my own, and I can do this, and you can do it. Anyone can do it. So thank you all so much. I don't want to end.
Thank you.
It's been amazing. I think we'll have to do an update at some point. Definitely all get together again. But thank you all very, very much. You've been amazing.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.